So it's about getting information about others in the environment, right? So it's really what it's about. It's not about just staring for a prolonged period of time at somebody. So I might look at you and then I might look away for a second and then I might ask a question, but then I'm going to look at you again to see, oh, did you process the question? What is his emotional reaction to it? And then my response, the next question I ask or next comment I make will be based upon a lot of what your nonverbal behavior is telling me. So a lot of communication is nonverbal. I think over 90% of it is just reading other people's body cues and facial expressions.
Kathy Obrien, thank you for joining me on the All About Kids podcast.
Hi, happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into the chat because we spoke a bit offline over email, and you sent me such a comprehensive and informative background on your work in autism, and we agreed to make this episode about working with autism and chatting about your career working with children who have autism. And so right off the bat, I'm just super curious, was the what was the experience or the path that drew you into working with children who have autism? How did you get involved? What was sort of the impetus for you to get involved with that?
So about 30 years ago, I had been working in a group home for adults with developmental disabilities. And there was one young man there who had no functional communication whatsoever. So in order to get his needs met, he would kind of act out, a little aggressively, maybe, hitting or punching. And I just felt like, I wish there was a way I could help him connect with others and, teach him a way to communicate. So for me, communication is just a way to connect with others, whether it's verbally or non-verbally. So I taught him the sign for eat, and I was hooked ever since. It was like a magical moment for me. It was just one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. So I think that was the beginning of it.
What did that feel like, teaching that person to essentially go from not being able to communicate the desire to eat something, and then all of a sudden in that moment, I feel like it's almost like a magic trick where you just let someone in on it and you show them how to do it, and now from that point forward, they know they can pull it out of the hat anytime they want. They could tell you, I want to eat something.
It was an incredible feeling. I really mostly just felt because of the social connectiveness, a connection of being able to communicate. Also, to develop the sense of agency that now this person has a way to get his needs met and to communicate his wants and needs and desires. So to me, it was just real pivotal. It's just a pretty life-changing event, let's just say. Yeah.
What were you doing before that? Was it in a similar line of work, or was it something completely different?
Yeah, I've always kind of worked in more of the helping professions. I had been a social worker working with families in a program for child abuse prevention, and had also been working as a social worker with adults who have psychiatric disabilities prior to that. So it was kind of an interesting segue, to still keep working in the helping profession, but now doing it more for communication, working with people with developmental disabilities.
And so once you had that experience where you were teaching this person how to communicate through, it was sign language. Where did you go from there? What was the next step once you realized the magic of that moment? How did your what was the next thing that you were trying to get into from there?
Sure. Yeah. So at that point, I had a degree in psychology, and I went back to school and got my master's in special education. And once I graduated, I first worked at a school for children with learning disabilities. And at that point, that was a few decades ago, primarily the students I work with have had dyslexia. So it was interesting because they're a very progressive school, and they were taking more of, looking at from doing a lot of research on dyslexia, and that it's a phonological based disorder. So they were pretty much kind of just making a lot of headway in terms of research and best practice. And then started working in a preschool classroom as a special ed teacher for children with autism. And at that point, we were using an ABA approach with the children. And, you know, my kids all made progress, but there was one little fella, and he didn't learn to talk. And I just wanted to know and understand why he didn't learn spoken language. And at that point in time, I didn't know what apraxia was. Had never heard of it, but decided, you know what, I want to go back to school and learn more about how to teach language and help children develop speech. So went back to school and got my second master's at that point in communication sciences and became a speech and language pathologist.
Mm. For people who may not be familiar, could you describe what ABA is and what that practice entails?
Yeah, so ABA is applied behavior analysis, and it's using a methodology that uses reinforcement, based in a nutshell, just reinforcement to increase the likelihood that a behavior would occur. So
Mm.
at that point in time, it was a lot of what we call discrete trial, but kind of moved into more focusing on a lot of manding or requesting behaviors, because it's great for teaching a lot of skills, but I think with some of my children we had to start there because they did have a lot of behaviors, and I think it's because they were a little bit frustrated they couldn't get their needs met. So so it's using reinforcement. It's a little more complex than that. There's other methods that they use to extinguish certain behaviors and so forth.
Yeah, and with the apraxia, what is apraxia again?
So apraxia is a motor speech disorder, and it's difficulty with the sequencing of sounds and language, the sounds of the language. So, for example, children go through developmental stages in their speech production, beginning with reduplicate babbling. They might say ba ba ba, ba ba ba, and eventually, where the consonant and the vowels are the same. And then eventually it gets a little more complex, where they might engage in what's called variegated babbling. So there's different consonant vowels, consonant vowel combinations, and might be like, something that sounds like a foreign language to us sometimes, like doody da do or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And then the next stage, if we look at children's speech production, the first words that they say are really simple syllables, like mama and baba, and animal sounds. And when we a lot of times, we just intuitively focus on modeling that for them because we know that's what's in their repertoire. And so it's very simple, two syllables that are the same consonants, same vowels, and then eventually they're able to produce more complex consonant vowel syllables, like say tuna, where the consonants are different and the vowels are different. So with apraxia, it's a difficulty in being able to make those articulatory transitions between sounds. If you were to say ah, or between syllables, tu, na.
Okay, so it's you're basically. I just want to repeat it back just to know that I have the gist of it. So you're having difficulty maneuvering between the sounds and syllables, either within the same word or between separate words entirely. Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
No,
Great
no,
summary.
it
Just,
actually.
yeah, that's the best way to describe it. Absolutely.
So I'm actually I'm doing French lessons now, and I have done it in the past. And French, the vowels connect a lot. There's a lot of just. It's almost like the language is smoothed out, and everything almost sounds like one word, at least to my ear as an English speaker, because English is much more harsh. So when you were talking about that being children having a hard time understanding syllables and vowels, I was thinking that's how French sounds to me when I hear someone speaking in French, I'm like, I don't know where one word starts and the other word ends. I just hear sounds.
Right. Yeah. And you'll get it though, because
Yeah.
once your brain incorporates that phonological system, and
Yeah.
yeah.
So one of the things that you sent me offline was the theory of mind and your notes on theory of mind, which I thought were fascinating. And what is theory of mind, and how is that involved in early childhood development? What makes theory of mind important?
Yeah. So theory of mind it's kind of a passion of mine to really understand that, because I think that theoretically, one of the core deficits in autism is this theory of mind, and it's basically an understanding of or knowledge that people have feelings and perceptions and intentions, and then just making those just making those inferences about what a person might be thinking or feeling, what their experience might be. And it's a theory that we have about people, and the question is, how do we come up with that theory, right? So, for example, you might be looking at somebody and looking at their body language, right? And reading their facial cues, and the position that their body is in, where it's facing, is their body looking kind of tense, and make some inferences about what their mental state or emotional state might be, and also in the context as well, right? So, theory of mind has to do with attributing some traits to people. So, for example, I might like vanilla ice cream, but somebody else might like chocolate. So, understanding that people have different likes and dislikes, that people have different reactions to certain things. Some people might like spiders. I don't like spiders. So, a theory of
Mm.
mind is, just making those inferences about people, based on what's kind of general or what's specific to a person.
Is that something that's translated in direct language, or is it something that's more of a feeling or a vibe that you get from someone?
So, is it, you mean, is someone actively thinking, oh, Joe is looking at the ice cream. He wants the ice cream. Is it like a linguist? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. Like, are the clues for theory of mind, or are like let's say someone that has difficulty picking up on theory of mind, is that something that is investigated in the direct language and the words that someone is using, or is it more that person has trouble understanding body language or eye
Sure.
contact, like things that you might not necessarily pick up in the words
Okay.
if you were reading a
So,
transcript or something?
right. Um, if you ever get a chance, you can YouTube Hyder and Semel. It's a 1949 experiment that they did. And if you look at it, it's really interesting, fascinating, because what they did was they took a bunch of shapes and they made the shapes interact in a certain way. And for a neurotypical person who is biologically programmed to instantaneously, within a millisecond, subconsciously be able to interpret cues, these shapes are just moving around. And I like to show that to people and say, tell me a story about what's happening here. And a neurotypical person might say, oh, the triangle is frustrated because the circle is trying to come through the door, and the triangle is stopping the circle from coming through the door. So we automatically just make those inferences without even thinking about it. And I'm not sure if it's language based, that we're actually thinking, our thoughts are encoded with language, but I think it's intuitive a lot of the times. But
Mm.
for a child who might have autism or social pragmatic difficulties, that's not instantaneous, and it's not that easy. Sometimes it has to be explicitly taught. So if you ever get a chance, look at the Hyder and Semel
Yeah.
experiment and just tell a story about it. And then you realize they're just shapes interacting, right? There's not even any facial expressions on these shapes. They're just moving around. But we automatically assign intentions and beliefs and
Mm.
feelings to our world as neurotypical people.
Yeah, I feel like that is I do think about that a lot where I go, why do I associate certain emotions or feelings or sympathies with objects or even certain animals just based on the way that they look? Because a lot of times people will sympathize more with animals just because they're more adorable. And, like there's a lot of people that want to save dogs or dolphins, but not a lot of people that want to save insects. And I also feel that because I see something that I am not necessarily picking up on its emotions, but I'm ascribing this
I
humanity to it.
I bet if you saw a butterfly flying right around you, you would just be like, "How awesome!"
But butterflies are
And
beautiful.
if it had a broken wing, you'd fix it or save it.
But butterflies are beautiful. I mean more like there aren't a lot of people that are advocating for the ugliest of animals or the like the animals that aren't as easy to anthropomorphize, like a neurotypical person would do with the shapes, where you go, okay, this shape has a feeling, this shape has an intention. I feel like it's a lot more common to associate feelings with animals
Yeah.
that we feel closer to. So I'm just wondering,
And do
and
you think a dolphin really has? I always thought a dolphin smile. I always thought that they look like they have a smile. So I get what you're saying. I
they
always think
yeah
they look happy to me. I don't know.
they do they look happy when I see them, but maybe there's I know that people say that dolphins are supposedly very smart. I have no idea, but I'm sure something's going on there, whether it's happiness or depression or a combination of things. But yeah, it's just fascinating to think about it. And when you were speaking about the experiment, it made me think, where does that come from? And I don't know if they came up with any definite conclusions in the experiment where it's like this part of your brain causes you to associate emotions with inanimate objects, or if it's just something that they
No, it's a
noticed.
great point. Yeah, it's just a very great point that you're making. I think that okay, so we're kind of projecting onto these, the shapes are just moving around, or projecting onto animals about, like you said, anthropomorphic, that what they might be feeling. Yeah, based upon we just can't help it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's where emojis come from because they are just
that's
shapes, but you just change it a little bit. Like you make an emoji and you give it one slanted eyebrow and it looks completely pissed off, and then you change it and it looks completely happy, and you curve the mouth a little bit, or you just alter it. So that's like the entire idea of emoji communication,
It's
emoji
interesting you
language.
said the eyebrows too, because they are probably one of the most salient features that we use to parts of the body that we use
Yeah.
to code and make inferences. It's right around that eyebrow area, so it's interesting.
So do people and children with autism, do they have difficulty picking up on changes in emotion when it comes to physical context? Because in that experiment you mentioned that the the non-neurotypical children were not necessarily associating emotions with shapes, and when we are showing emotions, we're essentially changing the shape of our face.
Yeah, so the experiment is interesting because I don't think it was really measuring whether neurotypical people, as compared to people with social pragmatic or autism, interpret. It's just an example that I use to show people. Just look at these shapes moving around, and I just say, "Tell me a story," and people will tell me stories, and just by the shapes moving around, assign intentions to them and beliefs and emotions and knowledge states. So fascinating. So the point being is that we, as neurotypical people, just are programmed that way. It's subconscious. It's instantaneous. We don't even, probably not even aware of it. We're not
Mm.
really stopping and thinking about it. It's just instantaneous. So getting back to your question of, okay, so where might these difficulties be and where do they originate? So a big part of it, the theory is that it starts in early childhood with the beginning of joint attention, and just that foundation skill is really the foundation for the social relationships and for making those inferences. There are stages actually with the joint attention, and a lot of children with autism will go through the stages of joint attention, and they will acquire developmentally, many of those later joint attention behaviors that occur later on in development, but it might be at a later age. So where you might have some children acquiring those joint attention skills before 20 months, a child who with autism might acquire it maybe 36 months, maybe 46 months later. But sometimes it has to be, we need to, do interventions for it. We need to really work on that with the children as well, because we don't want to jump so much into teaching language so much before we have joint attention, because that's a foundation skill. In order for a child to learn words, they need to be engaged with the environment and be engaged with the caretakers. And a lot of children learn new words not by direct instruction, but incidentally. So if mom turns her head and looks at a cat and says, "Oh, there's the cat," if the child is able to follow mom's gaze, which is just a stage in joint attention, here's mom say cat, here's his or her mom say cat, they now map that word cat onto that referent or that object cat. So without that joint attention is really pivotal. It's one of the foundation skills, early skills for which language will develop from.
It's what does joint attention look like? Like, if you were going to give an example of someone who is lacking joint attention, what does it look like when someone is not building joint attention skills?
So it starts really early, as early as 7 weeks. A baby will fixate more on a person's eyes and their mouth, right? So we might want to be looking at that. And then by 2 months old, a baby engages in what's called dyadic joint attention. So if you're looking close, looking at the baby's face, the baby is looking at you, and you stick out your tongue, the baby's attending to you, and we have this reciprocity where the baby might imitate sticking out the tongue. So you see those early imitation skills. At 3 months, a baby might start calling his or her caregiver. And, just going on by 8 or 9 months, there's social referencing, and there's a pretty interesting experiment called the visual cliff experiment. So if you have a caretaker on one end of this kind of like, it's kind of like a board, and then there's a clear board that the baby can, like plexiglass almost, the baby can crawl over. And if the baby's looking at the mom and the mom smiles, the baby knows it's safe to crawl across the plexiglass, even though visually it looks kind of dangerous, right? But if the mom looks scared, the baby won't crawl. So the baby is socially referencing at 8 or 9 months to see the mom's facial expression and, to make an inference, is this safe or not? So we see that without that face regard, or looking at the face, or, looking at the eyes and really, looking at that nonverbal communication, that, the child might have difficulty understanding more about the world, right? And then by 9 months, triadic joint attention occurs, where a child will look at mom, look at something, and then look at mom to see if mom is looking at it too. So again, that's that social referencing. And then by 8, 9, 12 months old, a child might begin to point to show objects or point to request objects. Now, we know that pointing is a big joint attention skill, because when the child points at something, they're assuming that the adult is perceiving what they're looking at, right? So there's that perception, attributing perceptions onto others and what others perceive. So, so those are some of the early behaviors that we always look at, to see, okay, is the child progressing along that continuum? So we can see how it's so. Now, when we talk about eye contact too, what is the purpose of eye contact, right? It's not really to stare at anybody, right? It's not about staring,
unless you're creepy.
Right. So it's about getting information about others in the environment, right? So it's really what it's about. It's not about just staring for a prolonged period of time at somebody. So I might look at you, and then I might look away for a second, and then I might ask a question, but then I'm going to look at you again to see, oh, did process the question? What is his emotional reaction to it? And then I might, my response, the next question I ask or next comment I make will be based upon a lot of what your nonverbal behavior is telling me. So a lot of communication is nonverbal. I think over 90% of it is just reading other people's body cues and facial expressions. So that's such a big part of it. And that's why I like to use a lot of wordless picture books, a lot of animated films without words. So we're really, focusing on the behavior, I'm sorry, the nonverbal behavior and making those inferences. I like to use some comedy because slapstick is very physical comedy, right?
Yeah.
So like I Love Lucy, I'll do with some of my older kids, and we'll decode the behavior because it's very exaggerated affect, right? And sometimes we need that to really get their attention and really help them make those inferences because it just makes it more salient. So then there's a lot of fun games to do with that too. If you're dealing with perceptions, we might understanding other people's perceptions, what they can see and not see. We might play barrier games, and even for little babies, you might play peekaboo. That's a way that they experiment with. What do I see? What do you see?
Yeah. Comedy is an interesting one because there's so many double meanings. You're looking at the comic's body language, especially if you're watching stand-up comedy. Do you find that when children with autism grow up, they have difficulty picking up on societal sense of humor? Where if, let's say, society finds something super funny, it's just generally accepted that this is something that's funny. Do you find that people with autism have trouble sort of locking into the the societal norm for sense of humor?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I have to ask people to explain a joke to me because I don't get it myself.
Yeah.
But a lot of it has to do with auditory processing and understanding multi. But yeah, I mean, comedy is such a. I think it's such that interpretation of comedy, and even to be a comedian requires so much, so much understanding about social nuances, right, and timing, right, multi-meaning words, understanding people's intentions as well. So, and sometimes, people have difficulty understanding somebody's intentions. If somebody says, makes a comment and they're trying to be funny, it's understanding that it wasn't meant to hurt you, the comment that they said. Understanding sarcasm is another area that may be potentially difficult because then you have to really understand people's intentions with sarcasm and tone of voice. It's another we call paralinguistic cue, nonverbal cue is tone of voice. It tells us a lot about what people's intentions are, what they might be feeling, and so forth.
Yeah. What would you say are the biggest myths about autism? Just something that you've noticed that the average person may believe that not to be true because you've worked with so many children with autism for so many years?
I think a big one is, that all people with autism are alike or the same, or that, they all have theory of mind deficits in these areas and so forth, I think, just we all have patterns of strengths and weaknesses, and, have to take people as individuals. We are individuals first. So I think that could be potentially something that may be an assumption, Yeah.
So autism is not a defining characteristic. Just because you get diagnosed with autism doesn't mean you really know what that person is about just because they have autism. There's thousands of other things that define their personality.
All of us.
Yeah. So another thing that you mentioned offline is play and role playing when it comes to developing a lot of these skills that come with theory of mind and joint attention. So when you are working with kids who you're trying to develop these skills with, what are some of the most common play routines or role playing games that you will do with some of these kids?
Yeah. Every person is different. Every child is different. You just have to meet the child where the child is at. For example, I have a little boy I was working with who just loved to spin things. He just loved just any spinning object. So he would, take anything and try to make it spin. He'd take a plate, make it spin. So we could, just kind of work on, okay, to me, the most important thing is the engagement and getting that reciprocity back. And just, getting that light in their eyes where they're having
Mm.
fun and joyful and interacting, that they want to interact with me. So I might take a dish, and if he's spinning it one way, I might say, okay, let's try to spin it this way, and just turn it on its side. Or I might consult with say if the child's receiving OT, what are some, I'm noticing that this little guy, he loves this feature about spinning. What can I do? What other activities can I do that have that quality? He might be spinning things, he or she might be spinning things because, as a way to self-regulate, or also because for now, this is maybe the sensory motor scheme that the child has, is being able to spin things and doesn't yet know how to operate on objects or, interact with objects and in different ways. So I want to expand that interest. For example, what I would do is I would get those little connecting gears, and we would take turns and we'd build some construction with those little gears. I got a Ferris wheel that we can, and we can press a button and make a turn, and
Mm.
then we could put people and animals on it. And then I had a little model airplane, so we built the airplane. It has a propeller, so we can make the propeller go.
Yeah.
We can do spirographs, we can do finger painting with circles, just things that have that dimension to it. And to me, it's mostly about getting into the child's world, and just that connectiveness to me is just the most important thing. And then eventually I might introduce some AAC, more or good or stop or, all done. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you're using the child's preferences in order to tailor these games to their personal needs. So you're finding
Right.
what they find
Right.
interesting, whether, like it's spinning or anime, I don't know, whatever they're into, and you can find a game that's tailored around that so it keeps their attention.
And I also love puppets. I think puppets are great for theory of mind because if you think about it, right? So if the child is using a puppet, the child has to make the puppet look at something. So
Mm.
right away, the child's making some inferences in what the puppet can see. So here again, we talk about theory of mind, understanding other people's perceptions. So puppets are also a great activity that I love to do. Um, so we look at, there are stages of play that children go through, starting with just maybe cause and effect, and eventually leading to symbolic play. But when children play at higher levels with that representational play, they represent in their play their experiences and knowledge of the world, right? So, if a child is playing with a train, we might, I would be there with the child with the train with whatever actions the child wants to do with the train. But maybe say about, hey, let's see if we can tweak this a little bit and maybe make the train go through a tunnel or go in a different direction, or we can build the train tracks together.
Mm.
So, it's just really working with where the child's at. At later levels of development, the child might represent common experiences like, playing house, or playing with dolls and feeding the baby. And then later on, experiment with experiences that are not pretty common, like in their play, it might represent going to the dentist or the doctor, so, and then later on, it's more fantasy play. So just really seeing where the child is at with that. If a child is has an obsession about, say, Star Wars, we can play Star Wars. We can get out the fort, get out whatever materials we need for that, and just play Star Wars and expand it, and just talk about all those, really talk about a lot about those theory of minds. Oh, what is he thinking? What does he want to do? I wonder what he's going to do next. Oh,
Mm.
he likes that. Yeah, he likes the that spaceship. So just really giving them the vocabulary for understanding people's desires, intentions, perceptions, emotions as well.
What advice do you have for parents who want to maximize their child's development, who has autism outside of services? Because you can only be involved with services as a kid so many hours per week. So a lot of your development comes under the watch of your parents. What are some insights or advice for parents that you have? Because I'm sure there are parents listening to the podcast that have children with autism that are looking to make sure that their kid is not falling behind when they're not meeting with a provider.
So, in terms of for the social piece, I know that making those inferences
Yeah.
and so forth. Yeah, yeah. So, I think I'm sure that the children are, reading books from school. They're sent home some reading lists to do. I think it might be helpful is to talk about the characters in the book and what the character traits are, right? Um, are they kind or are they not so kind? What the character likes, making some predictions about what the character might do based on those character traits. For example, if mom's birthday's coming up, dad might say, wonder what we should get mom for her birthday. So knowing what mom likes and doesn't like, the child would make an inference. Hey, mom likes arts and crafts. Let's get her needle set. Or she likes to read.
Mm.
Let's get her books. Same thing with the character traits, making those inferences. And then talking about the desire-based emotions. What is it that the character wants? And talking about those situation-based emotions. What is the situation that's happening and how is the character feeling about it. So another important piece, I think, for all children is really to help develop what we call emotional intelligence. So when I do stories with kids, I use a mood meter. We talk about how the character's feeling. We talk about the level of their emotions. Is it really high? Is it really low? What's their energy like? Because I think that's really important to be able to recognize what the feelings are. If you're reading a story, how do you know that the character is sad? Well, oh, look here, it describes how the character's feeling, that her eyes were looking down and she was frowning. So, picking up on those nonverbal cues when you're reading. And then maybe talking about how the character's feeling. Is it, I use the mood meter, is it a really intense feeling? And then another important piece too, I think, is to build resilience, to help build resiliency with our children, and to talk about, wow, how did that character was feeling very upset, very sad, or very angry. What did the character do to feel better? So we talk about helping become more regulated, emotionally. And then
Mm.
then there's the zones of regulation. A lot of curriculum out there for helping develop that as well. But I think that's one of the best ways that we can build resiliency with our children is helping teach them those regulation skills and coping skills. And we can do that through books too.
Yeah. So I'm curious because you've had your finger on the pulse of children's development for a long time. And within the past 10 to 15 years, social media use has skyrocketed, especially among young teenagers, even younger than that, like 8, 9 years old now. You see kids walking around with iPhones where their face is just buried in TikTok or buried in a different app. Have you noticed any sort of stunting or any any sharp differences in children's development in the last 10 years since social media has exploded? And do you think that social media has a part in any way affecting a child's development if it becomes overused?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, it would seem kind of logical if we're spending less time kind of looking at each other, sitting, and really interacting face to face. There might be some cues there that may be difficult to read through, platform, like, going through the computer like we are now, as
Yeah.
opposed to an in-person, three-dimensional person as opposed to
Exactly.
the
Well,
flat screen.
the metaverse will be here soon.
Yeah.
Mark
And
Zuckerberg is trying to fix that.
right, right. I mean, I don't want to put down technology. Technology is amazing, but
Yeah.
I think we have, I don't know, I'm kind of old fashioned. Maybe I think that we have to make time for play, one more interactive type of play too.
Yeah.
Although, although, access is sometimes difficult too. So I know that there's, I haven't done this yet, but one day it's a goal of mine to do, is to have kind of like, where kids can come together and they can do like a Lego building cooperative type of thing through the internet, because it might be hard for a child who loves Legos to find another
Mm.
child with the same intensity of that passion. So I think that would be kind of cool one day to do. But yeah, and then work on the social skills and turn taking and conversation skills through that, and collaboration too, very important.
Yeah.
Collaboration, yeah, something that everybody needs to kind of be mindful of, and work on, I think sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To go along with the play and collaboration, you you obviously need perception. And there was a quote from your presentation that I wanted to bring up that I think is fascinating about perception. And it says children experiment with seeing leads to knowing during hide and seek games. They understand that perception leads to knowing. Someone who looks inside a box will know what is in it, but someone who cannot see inside the box will not know. What have you noticed, and what have you learned about the way that a neurotypical child develops perception compared to someone who may have autism, and those differences in development?
Well, what's really such an uncomfortable thing for me is that so understanding deception, right? That people might have intentions and to mislead you, right? So it's not really something I want any little child to know about in the world, right? But children do go through a certain stage in development, 4 or 5 years old, where there's a reason fairy tales, are taught at that age, or are very interesting for children as a genre, because it has to do with deception and false beliefs, and the trickster tale so much.
Mm.
So
Well, and if you know
um,
about it, you can then combat it as a teenager and adult. Because if you don't learn
that's
about
very true.
deception, then you're an easy candidate to be deceived.
Right. And there is this great game out there. It's called Fibber. And basically, you throw down a card and you say, whether you say you throw down an alien card, and you might say, I'll just throw down the alien card. And the other players have to decide whether you're fibbing or not. So we do play that game because, it's something that they need to realize, that people might not say what's true, and it's very uncomfortable because I don't want them to, they're so innocent, but it's survival skill in a sense, I guess. So yeah, so we will do fairy tales and understanding the false beliefs type of tasks with fairy tales, or games such as Fibber, and even barrier games are great because you know um, when you play a barrier game, and so a barrier game is something like you might have a barrier, and then you might have, say, blocks on two children sitting opposite each other, a barrier in the middle, and then the child will give instructions to build something to the other child, and then they'll give instructions and so forth, and then at the end you take a look and see how similar they were. So that has a lot to do with, well, did that my partner have the same vision in their head as I had? And that's a theory of mind task. Battleship games, another great theory of
Mm.
mind task, right? So yeah, so there's a way to do it in a very child sensitive way, with a lot of games and stories and so forth.
Well, Kathy O'Brien, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Where can people follow you or keep up with your work?
Um, well, I don't really have a website, but if you like, I can give you my email at a certain point in time. I don't. I guess that would be it, or I don't know. How does
Yeah,
this
yeah,
work?
we can include that in the description. If anyone has any questions, they can reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been working with All About Kids for quite a while. Great agency, and I'm just very happy to be here and spend this time with you to talk about this really great topic.
Yeah, of course. I really I appreciate your insight, and I know that the listeners, which range from parents to other providers to just someone in the general public that stumbles across the podcast, I know they'll appreciate your insight. And I think what you work in is fascinating, and it's always worth talking about. And I'm sure we could do 2 or 3 or even 5 episodes on what you do, and would love to have you back for another round of this. And again, thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast.